have the top of the hour here. We'll give just a minute more. It looks like folks are still hopping into the briefing, so we'll get started at 1 minute after. All right, good morning. I want to be respectful of everybody's time and go ahead and get started. Thank you all for joining us this morning for this part one of a three-part series of a cybersecurity briefings. This morning, we're going to specifically focus on NIST 800-171, that standard, and how to plan for and complete your self-assessment. The two other webinars that are coming up, the first of which is on April 7th, will not only focus on NIST 800-171, but the new CMMC standard and what it looks like to get a gap assessment completed. And then the third part of our series that will then be the following Wednesday, which is the 14th, will not also focus on 171, but CMMC and remediation as well as ongoing compliance. So we hope that you find today's information valuable and will join us for those other two webinars coming up over the next 2 weeks. So hopping right in, I'm Elizabeth Niedringhaus, President and CEO of SSE, and thrilled to be here with you this morning. I'm joined today by Greg Thornton and Charlie Shudo, and I'd love to ask them to introduce themselves, please. Greg?
Good morning. My name is Greg Thornton. As you see, I am the Vice President of Network and Security Services. I've been with SSE for closing in on 7 years, focused on customer service, service delivery, and account management, and together with Charlie and the team, prepping ourselves and our clients for NIST 800-171 readiness and adherence. Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you, Greg. And Charlie, over to you to introduce yourself.
Good morning. My name is Charlie Shudo. I am VP of Technology and Security here at SSE. Been here about 13 years. Responsible for compliance from a technical perspective. I lead research and development for satisfying controls practices on a technical level for all of our systems. So that includes CMMC, NIST 800-171, and the NIST 800-53 that we use in our classified systems that we manage for our prime customers.
All right, great. Thank you both. And they will be joining me throughout the webinar, monitoring the QA. So please, as we go through today's webinar, remember to ask your questions as they come up. Again, we'll try to answer them in the chat. Otherwise, we'll save them to the end if there's a number of the same questions so that we can answer them for the full audience today. For those of you that may not be familiar with SSE, just to give you some quick background, SSE was actually founded back in 1966 by Susan Elliott as a woman-owned small business. She was determined to get in on the ground floor of the PC, and so that's where she really focused on growing the business in 1983. Of course, most folks at that point in time had no idea how to use personal computers, and that's really where our training services began. Very quickly, out of providing that classroom instruction, large corporations in St. Louis that were rolling out PCs across their enterprises quickly turned to SSE, given our reputation in the market, and asked for help in getting those personal computers rolled out. And that began our IT services business. That quickly obviously grew into network services, and today is, of course, our IT and cybersecurity services. We began doing work for the DOD back in 2009, and that's really where our cybersecurity expertise began to develop. as we began to manage classified programs. Today, we're focused in the financial services sector as well as the defense sector, helping companies get to and meet certain cybersecurity requirements, and then the ongoing maintenance of those environments to maintain their compliance. Our quality management system, we're pleased to have met the ISO 9001:2015 standard, and again believe it is the secret sauce in our ability to provide cybersecurity compliance services to our customers. So again, why SSE when you think of NIST 800-171 and CMMC? It's because we really have a unique combination of experiences and expertise. For one, I mentioned our cybersecurity expertise that dates back 11 years. But on top of that, we are a defense contractor ourselves. So we're walking in your shoes and understand the rigors of compliance that are required when doing work for the DOD. We also have had a professionally managed IT service practice for the last 16 years, supporting commercial operations in their IT services who have fully outsourced those functions to us in order to monitor and maintain their servers, provide help desk services, but now, of course, to manage their ongoing compliance with cybersecurity. And finally, as I mentioned, it's our mature business processes and, of course, the requirement to the ISO standard that allows us to so successfully provide these services to our clients. We are thrilled to announce we were one of the first, or at least one of the first two CMMC RPOs, that is Register Provider Organizations. So the DOD set up the CMMC Accreditation body last year. Again, we are one of the very first in Missouri to achieve this status with the CMMC AAB. What that means is that we have folks on our staff who have completed the required training and successfully tested to the standard, as well as have had the appropriate security clearance and signed the CMMC AB's Professional Code of Conduct, which puts us in a great position to help advise our clients on not only the NIST 800-171 standard, but the future CMMC standard as well. So today in the webinar, we're going to walk through background on the NIST 800-171 standard, when it came into effect, how we got to where we are today with the DFARS interim final rule and the required self-assessments. We're going to walk through how to complete a self-assessment, what exactly is needed, how to go ahead and submit that score, and talk about what you need to be doing in terms of planning for getting this work completed, as well as the potential risks of non-compliance. And then at the end, of course, we're going to open it up for question and answer. But again, please do not hesitate to use the Q&A folder up at the top of the screen and enter any questions you have as we go through the webinar this morning. So again, NIST 800-171, it's not a new requirement. If you have the DFARS clause 252.204-7012 in your contracts, you will be very familiar with the NIST 800-171 standard, or at least you should be. The Obama administration actually back in 2014 mandated compliance to the NIST 800-171 standard. And it was required then in the DFARS clause 7012, as I've noted, that every defense contractor was required to comply to that NIST 800-171 standard and self-attest back in December 31st of 2017. So again, this is not a new requirement. It's just there are new pieces to it in terms of self-assessment and entering a score and that self-assessment, which we will get into. So from 2017, if you fast forward to 2019, the DOD Inspector General came out with a report that said that they did not believe that the DOD contractors had consistently implemented the requirements to the NIST 800-171 standard, and actually recommended to the DOD that they take steps to assess a contractor's ability to protect controlled unclassified information throughout the supply chain. Then later on in that same year, in November of 2019, Katie Arrington, who worked for the Office of the Undersecretary for Defense and Acquisition and Sustainment, actually came out and said that they believe that only 1% of the companies in the defense industrial base had actually met all 110 controls that were required by NIST. So hence, the interim final rule that came out back in September of last year that amended DFARS 252.204-7012 and went into effect actually on November 30th, takes a two-pronged approach. Today in this webinar, we're really going to focus on the first of those two approaches, which is really built around NIST 800-171. And there are two DFARS clauses in particular we're going to focus on, 7019 and 7020, and what's required in terms of compliance to NIST 800-171. Then our future webinars that I mentioned earlier will focus on the second part of this two-pronged approach, which is CMMC, the Cybersecurity Maturity Model Certification that's required under DFARS 252.204-7021. So if you're wondering who is affected by this amendment, it is all DOD contractors and subcontractors. It is meant to affect the entire defense industrial base. The only exclusion is for commercial off-the-shelf software products. We believe this presents a very unique challenge for defense manufacturers and suppliers, because not only do they need to consider safeguarding the controlled unclassified information in their back office on their computer systems, but they need to consider very clearly the integration of those systems with the CNN machines on the shop floor. So let me hop in, and I know this is a bit of an eye chart, but walk you through the interim final rule and exactly what is required for defense contractors. Down the left-hand side of the screen, you will note we're going to cover who is exactly affected, when it's required, how it's required, and what specifically is required. And I've tried to create a table such that you can compare it to DFARS 7012, which has now been amended by 7019 and 7020, and again 7021, which directly relates to CMMC, which we will cover later. So again, the challenge with 7012, as you will note down here, is the orange box or the empty box on the spreadsheet. So 7012 again required contractors to comply with NIST 800-171, and it allowed for, if there were gaps, for companies to outline a POAM, a plan of action and milestone to get into compliance. However, all this was done on the honor system. There was no way to hold defense contractors accountable or actually enforce their compliance in working through their POAM items. So 7019 requires that companies must have completed a self-assessment prior to contract award. That, and we're going to get into specifically how to do that, but that self-assessment must be completed in the Supplier Performance Risk System, SPRS, cannot be more than 3 years old, and must specifically include your system security plan, your score, which again we're going to walk through, and the date that you expect all items to be completed. 7020 follows on the heels of 7019, and it can be enforced after contract award, but it allows the DOD for higher, medium and higher risk contracts to come into a contractor's environment and actually review their self-assessment to verify that they've properly met the controls that they've identified and they've worked through the POAM items as they were identified. So again, moving forward, specifically again, talking through 7012, the challenge with 7012 was, again, it continued to allow contractors to process and store CUI without having implemented all 110 controls of NIST 800-171. And really, it was not enforceable in terms of making contractors get into compliance. So again, as I mentioned, looking at 7019 and 7020, again, a self-assessment must be completed prior to contract award. So DCMA has created an assessment methodology which outlines a standardized scoring system that reflects requirements. So of those 110 requirements, your score will actually reflect those that are not yet implemented. The other piece of these assessments is that it requires that all contractors, prime contractors and all other contractors who have subcontractors, must make sure that those subs have an assessment prior to even issuing a subcontract. And again, this is how the DOD envisions getting these requirements pushed out through the entire supply chain. The URL noted below is the link to the SPRS database where you go in and enter your self-assessment score. Charlie's going to walk you through again later exactly how to do that. And we'll send these slides out afterwards so that you have those links. Again, this assessment methodology created by DCMA is meant to be a very objective assessment. It's built based on a weighted scoring system. So of the 110 controls, some have a value of 1 point, some controls have a value of 3 points, and some are assigned 5 points. So again, what's interesting about this score is it reflects the net effect of the security requirements that you have not yet implemented. So if you have all 110 controls implemented, you would have a perfect score of 110. But for every security requirement that you have not met and have a POAM item for, you must subtract that value, so whether it's worth 1, 3, or 5 points from the 110. I have a link here again to this DOD assessment methodology, but again, Charlie will walk you through some of this later on in the webinar. So again, I've just noted here an example of controls on the left and the specific security requirements. And again, you can see how a value is assigned to each. All right, now we're going to hop into what it looks like to actually submit your NIST 800-171 self-assessment. And I'm going to turn it over to Charlie now, who's been working closely with our customers on doing this. Charlie? Charlie, I think you might be muted. I'm not sure.
Double muted. I do that
Double
sometimes.
muted. Okay.
So what do you need for your score? Obviously, you need two things. You need your SSP, your system security plan, and your POAM items. So those are plan of action and milestones. So the system security plan basically is all of your 110 controls and items showing how you are implementing, not implementing, etc. for each control. And then the plan of action and milestones basically are a corresponding document. If you have an item in your SSP that states you are either non-compliant, partially compliant, sometimes we see on SSPs, those have to have corresponding plan of actions on your POAM list. So then that way you can state, here's how I'm going to implement them, and then by what dates. And again, if you do not have an SSP, that's the one specific thing that you need for that to submit your self-score, then you cannot submit a self-score. I can go on to the next slide, Elizabeth.
There you go.
So again, what do you need to submit your score? We're talking about specific information. So you're going to go to the PIEE, the Procurement Integrated Enterprise Environment website. So you'll need a PIEE account. From there, you're going to have to assign yourself a role for SPRS, the cyber vendor role. We have seen that it may be assigned but inactive, so you may have to make it active and may have to request that through PIE support. If you are doing this, please call them. It will be a lot faster than submitting emails, I promise. You'll need the date of the assessment, the summary score. So example, like we have here, 95 out of 110 would be a sample score that you'd have to provide. The scope of the assessment, which basically is your cage code. And then the plan of action, so POAM items completion date. So think of that as the date that you plan to have all 110 points accounted for as part of your score. So you'll want to make sure you give yourself ample time to meet your timeline. Next slide. So step one is PIE access. Once you get access and log in, you're going to go from the landing page and add an additional role. And if you do have the role already assigned, you're going to have to manage your roles. You'll go in there and you will basically go and hit the slider down or the drop down list for SPRS, Supplier Performance Risk System. And there you'll have two things to choose from. You want to do the SPRS cyber vendor user. If you do the other one, I promise it won't work. I did that the first time. But once you do that, you add that role and save, and it's instantaneous as far as when you have access to that new system. You may have to refresh the page, but that SPRS icon should show up. Next slide. So again, here's a picture of that SPRS icon that I was showing on the landing page. You'll log back in. You'll see the SPRS icon, you'll click on that, and another page will come up, open up another window. And on the left-hand side, you have menu items that you can click on, and one of them is NIST SP 800-171 assessment. You'll click on that. Go to the next page for me, Elizabeth. And then here's how you actually start the process of submitting your assessment. So you should have a header view that shows if you have previous assessments. If you don't, on the next page, you'll be able to create a header. That header will allow you to select your cage code if there's one that already exists. And if not, we can talk about what you might have to do in the future if that doesn't exist. Elizabeth, on to the next slide, please. All right, here's where you would click create a header if you did not have a cage code specified. So once you click create new header, you can click type levels cage search unless you know your cage code. And if it's in the system, it'll show up once you hit top level cage search. You select your cage code. You're going to select your confidence level, and in this case, it's going to be basic. I believe if it's a third party is when you select anything other than basic, if I remember correctly. And then your assessment standard, which would be NIST SP 800-171. Next slide. Here are the details that you need to submit your assessment. So again, the assessment date, as mentioned earlier, the score that you got as part of your self-assessment, the assessing scope, I believe should be enterprise for all applications. And then the plan of action completion date, that's where you're going to list your date where you specify, you will have all 110 controls accounted for and you'll have a perfect score. Once you select that, you click save and you have entered your score into the system. Next slide. So troubleshooting steps. Some of these I've already mentioned as we've gone through. Don't see a cage code, create a header. And if for some reason you don't have a cage code, you'll have to, get in touch with the System Award Management Database to get that rectified. Make sure that you have the SPR Cyber Vendor User set to active. If you do have a problem with PIE, the best way is to contact the help desk. Just in case in point, when we first started trying to do this ourselves, I had submitted email requests and the email requests took forever to be responded to, and they were canned responses. And picking up the phone and calling them, we were on hold for 45 minutes to an hour, but someone was there, got us fixed up right away, and we're able to move forward. So if time is of the essence, please use the phone to call. Next slide.
Mhm.
And here are those helpful links again, as Elizabeth mentioned. They are going to be sent out after the webinar is completed, so you will be able to look at this document, be able to notate these and click on these if needed. Okay.
Great. Thank you, Charlie, so much. I wanted to hop into, as you're looking at the NIST 800-171 scoring, what are two of the largest factors that will impact your score? And the first is IT tools. As you can imagine, there's a considerable number of tools that are required to meet the 110 controls. We've documented the 15 systems that we've implemented in order to get in compliance. As you will note, we've laid those out across the CMMC actually domains, but they're very similar to the NIST families. And you will see then how each system, and it's color-coded across the various controls, lays out against, again, all 110 controls. What's interesting to note that if you do not have this full suite of IT tools in place, it will cause a third of the points to be deducted from your perfect 110 score. Again, a 90-point deduction from your weighted score without these IT tools. We have a fully vetted IT tool tech stack that not only meets the ITAR requirements, but have also been evaluated and implemented and running in our environment and other client environments, obviously having closely taken a look at functionality as well as cost for the companies that we serve. So we'd love to talk to you about our tech stack. If again, as you look down this list, you're realizing that you are deficient in one of these or all of these systems. In addition, group policies are a critical component to your overall solution and meeting the NIST 800-171 controls. As you will see, as we've rolled out in orange across the various controls, there are a significant number of them that must be met with group policy. Believe it or not, between the IT tools and group policies, if you do not have both of those in place, it's a 50% deduction from your total score, 152-point deduction. We've worked with several customers who asked, had completed their own self-assessment, asked us to come in and complete a NIST assessment for them. And based on what their score was, we were able to quickly implement, for example, our group policy templates and allow them to enter a much better score than they would have without the group policy template. So again, these are a critical component to getting a good score when you go to implement and when you, I should say, self-assess and then go to implement your score in SPRS. And again, we'd love to talk to you and walk you through those group policy templates. So again, if you're thinking about where am I today and how do I get to a point where I'm compliant to NIST 800-171, we have a 4-step plan. And I'd love to turn it over to Charlie again to walk you through each of these 4 steps. Charlie?
All righty. So step 1 is plan. So per the DOD scoring methodology, as I mentioned earlier, you have to have an SSP. Don't have an SSP, you need to build one. So there's some items that you need to make sure you cover. So obviously you need to know what your system boundary is. So think of that as where your CUI resides. It doesn't need to be your entire network per se. It could be you have a room that where your CUI is and there's a network in there, kind of like a classified environment. It just depends on how you have your environment built. The system environment and network diagram, which I just mentioned, that where the CUI is covered. And then again, all 110 controls listed with some status. Excuse me. So those statuses usually are implemented, not applicable, not implemented. If you have a not applicable, that's as good as having a full 1, 3, or 5 points, depending on what that is. But again, one of those controls could be partially implemented. We do see those on some of our SSPs. Be aware, that doesn't make the control compliant. So you can't take advantage and say, well, I'm partially compliant, so I need to give myself 1 point here, 3 points here, whatever it is. The only place, and I think there's either 2 or 3 controls that you can do this. There are some that state that you can get partial credit for points. I think one of them is multi-factor authentication, for example. So just an FYI there. Again, you already have all this. Review and update your POEM items and your existing SSP. So your score. Follow the DOD methodology in assessing your score. And where we have here, grade your own homework, avoid using the curve. So again, as an assessor myself, close is not good enough for full credit for each control. You have to have evidence that clearly shows that you're meeting the specifics of the control. Understand what isn't done yet and has to be done, know your timeline, and then do your POEM items. So just as an example, in our experience, when we're performing gap assessments, after we collect all the evidence and scoring, usually what we'll do is we'll ask a customer what they scored themselves already if they already have their score in SPRS. And they'll give us a sum score. We have found once we go in and we do our discovery, there's a significant difference in what the customer scored themselves versus our score that we give them. And we've even seen some get into the negative triple digits. So just be aware, again, don't grade your own homework using a curve. Be very specific that you meet your controls.
All right, thank you.
Next slide. And then submit. This kind of goes over what I'd already mentioned before. Verify your cage codes in the SAM. Verify you've got a PIE account. You got the SPRS cyber vendor role assigned. From there, you access SPRS. You go ahead and go to where you submit your NIST 800-171 assessment, and then you follow the steps to add your new assessment, score, scope, POEM items, completion date, and then the SSP. So it will even ask in some instances a version number for your SSP. So this is version 1.5. You'll put in version 1.5 and then the date of the creation of the SSP. So again, when you have to have that done is prior to the next contract award or at the direction of what your DOD/prime contact states.
That's right, Charlie. Our own prime customer, what was it, had us submit our score by March 8th, was it?
Yes.
Oh, all right. And on to the last
and then
step.
Finally, all submissions must include a completion date by which your company will fully meet all 110 controls. So again, the big thing there is giving yourself time to meet your timeline. This is a huge undertaking. I'm making no mistake about it. To make sure that you have everything set up that you need to have and make sure you meet all the controls. So just make sure you give yourself enough time. And then, you want to mitigate any potential risk and make sure that you don't have, avoid knowing any reckless misstatements or knowing any misstatements, which I'm sure Elizabeth will touch on here in a few minutes.
All right, great. Thank you, Charlie. So as Charlie mentioned, the risk component to this, and I did want to touch on this because there is obvious the lost revenue if you didn't have a score in place and you were not able to get that done prior to a contract award or your prime contractor looking to subcontract with you. So that's sort of the fairly obvious risk. I think the less obvious risk to some contractors, though, however, is we believe that the courts will find companies at fault for knowing or reckless misstatements under the False Claims Act. And to provide a little more depth to that, it is a false claim to make a statement material to a contract claim for payment that is known to be false or in reckless disregard of the truth or in deliberate ignorance of the truth. This includes statements made to induce an award for a contract. So again, a knowing or reckless misstatement of your NIST 800-171 score could set you up for a claim under the False Claims Act. And we believe the new rules appear to have been crafted to get contractors' False Claims Act attention. The civil risk is at $5,000 to $10,000 penalty per misstatement, plus 3 times the amount of damages the government suffers. This has been held to be the entire contract value of a falsely induced contract. So again, I cannot underscore the importance of making sure that you're very clear about what is required by each NIST 800-171 control, and that you are very clear and specific, as Charlie said, not giving yourself partial credit in order to avoid any claim under the False Claims Act. So Bob, we've got a NIST 800-171 assessment where we can help contractors. Did you want to take a minute to walk folks through what that would look like?
Absolutely. Thank you, Elizabeth. And this actually came at the request of several clients as well as a partner of ours that were focused on, okay, CMMC is definitely coming. But before I get to that, I really need to focus on NIST and take care of that, and I need help. I either don't have an SSP and POAMs in place, or it's been several years since we've updated them, and what can you do to help us get up to speed quickly with the interim final rule and those associated requirements now in place. So we've worked with our partner to come up with a NIST 800-171 assessment. It's a 3 to 4 week engagement. It would involve the review of any existing SSP or POAMs. It would involve a scan of your existing network. We use a tool that does not take any data from your network. It just looks at what IT tools you have in place, how many servers, how many workstations, are they being patched regularly, are all of the supporting elements updated and functioning properly. And then we've developed a questionnaire to quickly collect evidence on all NIST 800-171 requirements. The deliverables of this assessment would be the information you need for an SSP with any applicable POAMs, as well as your NIST 800-171 assessment score. So if you have not yet done this on your own, or you are looking at that and thinking this is going to be more time and resources and expertise than I currently have available, yet I do need to get this in per the DOD or any deadline from a prime, this is something we have packaged in a relatively quick and efficient way to assist clients in getting that first step done. Following this, there would obviously be more to do with CMMC, full gap assessments on that end. Shameless plug for our second session next week, which will dive more into those details. But we would be happy at the conclusion of this webinar to set up time to discuss on this assessment and how we might be of service further.
Yeah, Bob, thank you. I think as we found working with so many customers, if they're not deeply kind of read into these controls, they can be super confusing exactly what the government's after and what needs to be in place. So again, looking at this assessment to help companies who haven't been through it in that kind of depth to help get them up to speed and get what they need in place. So thank you for covering that. And we have just a couple polling questions before we get to the Q&A. The first one is, given the interim final rule, we're curious how many of you all have already submitted your DOD scored self-assessment. And we'll give you a moment to respond. Bob, you can tell me when we're getting close here.
Yep, we're still getting responses coming in, so we'll give it a little bit more time, Elizabeth.
Okay, thank you.
Okay.
All right, well, this is interesting. Very, very similar to a webinar that we hosted just a little over a month ago. 78% have not submitted their score. Again, back in February, I think it was about 70%. So very, very similar. And we know that companies are looking at this and really working hard to make sure that they think about how they get that score submitted. All right, our next question, we advance here, is if you haven't submitted your DOD self-assessment score, do you believe your organization is internally prepared to complete that self-assessment? And we'll give you just a moment if you're unsure or yes or no. Give you a moment to respond.
We'll give it a little bit longer, Elizabeth. Still some responses coming in.
Okay, thank you, Bob. Okay, again, roughly a third of you saying you're unsure, understandably, probably want to talk to folks within your organization. A little less than 10% who feel that they have the expertise in-house. And again, 60% of you that recognize that you probably need to reach out to outside experts to help. Again, very consistent with what we saw in February. So moving on to the final polling question. I can advance the slide here. Do you believe your organization is prepared to handle and maintain the ongoing cybersecurity compliance requirements internally? And again, give you a moment to respond, but I guess this really plays on, it's one thing to understand what it takes to get to a compliant state, but really to maintain compliance is a whole nother additional set of job responsibilities inside an organization. And again, just curious how many organizations feel like they're prepared to handle that internally.
Still some responses coming in, Elizabeth. We'll give it a little bit longer.
Okay, thank you. All right, so again, about a third unsure, roughly 40% of you that feel like you are in a good position to maintain that compliance status. And again, another third who are unsure. Again, pretty consistent with the results that we've seen in February. Obviously, we'd love it if you could attend the next webinars. We think we'll get into the components that relate not only to getting to compliance, but also maintaining compliance that you might find invaluable. So with that having been said, I want to open it up to question and answer. I have a feeling there were quite a few. I could see on my screen that Q&A button lighting up. So Bob, I'll turn it over to you to lead us through the Q&A, please.
Thank you, Elizabeth. A couple quick housekeeping ones. We were asked if a recording of this webinar will be available afterwards. Yes, we will be sending out an email where you will have access to this information. Absolutely. We also had several questions about the grading on a curve and what exactly that meant. I believe Greg has answered that, but in short, it was just don't give yourself the benefit of saying we fully meet something if you're not 100% sure. You want to err on the side of caution so as not to overinflate a potential NIST score, as Charlie spoke to. But a couple of questions I did want to direct to Charlie for his expertise for the group. Charlie, the first one relates to an SSP, and does the SSP itself have to be written in a certain format? If you could please answer that.
No, it could be Word, Excel. I mean, there's a lot of templates that are out there on the internet that you can download and use, as long as they have the specific items I mentioned earlier about, you know, your system boundary, system information, network diagram, you know, who's responsible for the system, et cetera, so forth.
Perfect. Thank you, Charlie. Stay on camera. Don't go anywhere just yet. Another follow-up question on that. How long does it take to do an SSP if someone was starting from scratch?
From scratch? It depends on the scope. I mean, you can have a single environment that's got, you know, just, you know, a few users, a few machines. And so you've got a small environment, almost like an enclave per se. But you could have, you know, a large environment that's got, you know, 50 different sites and, you know, 10,000 users. I mean, it really depends on scope. I think going through, and if you know your environment and your tools well, I would figure to fill one out might take, you know, a month or so, would just be the best guess. But then refining it, making sure that you're meeting the control specifically how you need to, and then, you know, creating your POEM items could take a great deal longer.
Thank you, Charlie. This next one, I know this might be difficult to answer, but how do I know if my current IT tools are meeting NIST requirements?
So this is a loaded question. Putting a tool in place to meet a control isn't enough. You may do your research and make sure that, hey, this is an antivirus software that does this, that, or the other that we need. But putting it in place, again, is one thing. Making sure that it's working across all of your systems, it's updating, it's scanning certain things. So that has to be part of your continuous monitoring program, and that's part of the configuration management domain. So there are specific controls around that you have to specify to meet that. And also, Elizabeth, I think mentioned this at the beginning of the webinar. If you're meeting NIST 800-171, you're almost certainly doing it to meet DFARS 7012, and a lot of that's around export control. So if you're using a cloud-based tool, and this is something that we had made a mistake in the past, you know, years ago. We had a tool that was not in it wasn't ITAR compliant, and basically meaning it's not hosted on shore. So AWS GovCloud, Azure Government are examples. So you may have an antivirus tool that is in, you know, in AWS, not AWS GovCloud, and that's replicated to a data center in Australia or a data center in Germany. You need to make sure that that is hosted onshore. And then the other requirement is that the support staff that they use are either U.S. citizens or have a valid green card. So again, that's why I said it's a loaded question. You know, there's a lot around continuous monitoring. There's a lot around ITAR compliance. And if the tool's hosted in the cloud, you got to make sure that's adhered to. Usually if you're using a FedRAMP type system, you're usually okay.
Thank you, Charlie. We just got another question in that asked if you could elaborate a little bit on slide 28 and specifically SSE's tech stack.
Elizabeth, could you go back to that, that slide for me?
I was going to do that. Yep. Let me head back. Sorry. I think one more. Okay.
Okay. So if you look at items 1 through 15, those are the tools, not the tools we use. That's the function that they adhere to. So remote management and maintenance, that's what we're using to remote control systems, apply maintenance, so that way we can take controls of the machines, run commands in the background to clean up systems. A second item is backup and disaster recovery. So a BDR solution, usually we're looking for a system that will back up your servers, back up the CUI, and then make it so that you can restore them as needed. IT automation software is what we're using, so then that way we can do a lot of things in the background, and not be, a human saying, hey, I need to run this command on 15 systems and doing it manually. So we have scripting that we run to ease the deployment of some software, deployment of tools, endpoint protection, that's antivirus, security awareness training. That is another item. So basically you're having to make sure that you're training all of your users, on latest security threats. If they, they get phishing emails that come in, they make sure they don't click on, where's my UPS shipment, and then goes there and they've been phished for information. So that's what's part of that. The next one is system information and event monitor. This is an interesting one. So every system, you're doing continuous logging of your system. So if people are logging in, you're taking record of that. You need to make sure that that's centrally managed. It's not good enough to have logging on each system because that can be manipulated. You take all those logs and you funnel them into one system so they're searchable, and then you have, history of however long you need to. Usually a year is enough, but some people may have specific requirements that need it longer. But that's what that stands for. Intrusion detection prevention. This is a system that would go in correspondence with your firewall. So think of it as your firewall is the door to your network, but there's a guard dog right behind it just to make sure that something else can't get in. So what we're doing is we're looking for specific, I know what I'm trying to say, patterns. That's what I was trying to say. The specific patterns of, like large chunks of traffic coming from, certain countries, certain IP addresses. Again, and I'm very technical, so if I'm being too technical, I apologize. But it's basically looking at that information, and then based on those patterns, actions can be taken either automatically or specifically by your security operations center or SOC. Multi-factor authentication, that's really, a second factor. So when you log into a system, either you're going to get a text, you're going to get a push notification, you're going to get an email, something that's going to be a second form to say, hey, yeah, this really is me logging in. Firewall, just kind of mentioned that. Mobile device management, that is if you have a risk of having CUI on phones based on our mobile devices, based on either applications you have or with an email. This gives you the flexibility to be able to look at that system at all times, that phone at all times, being able to see if it's encrypted, if something changes, if for some reason it's out of security compliance. So somebody doesn't have a passcode on their device. Someone doesn't have the latest patch on their device that addresses some kind of 0-day vulnerability. So that's what mobile device management is. It also makes it so that if you feel that there could be a breach on that phone, you can easily erase that phone. So next item is VPN. One thing that's mentioned is when you're doing remote work, that all of that be encrypted to FIPS encryption levels. So VPN, there are other ways to do it, but VPN is a service that we use, and I'm sure a lot of you do, just to make sure that traffic is encrypted going back and forth to where the CUI resides. Session management, this is, you have to have controls around if you walk away from your machine locks in a certain amount of time. So let's say 15 minutes, the screen goes to the lock screen, and then you have to put your username and password in. Another version of that is, even if you're logged on and inactive and the session is locked or the screen is locked, after a certain amount of time, you still have to log the person off. So then that way someone can't continuously try to get in with that person's credentials. So, for us internally, we have that as 12 hours. So if someone is idle for 12 hours, it all logs their system off. Might make some users angry at first, but just know that. Encryption, this is disk encryption. So obviously you have disk encryption on, you're going to need that on all your devices where CUI is. This can be your backup devices. This can be your storage area networks or network attached storage, your servers, your workstations. So that's what that goes to. Spam protection. So basic spam filtering usually works, but there are specific controls in CMMC that states you have to have certain records in place, certain type of spam filtering like sandboxing. So that's another item. And then finally, web filtering. So not only are you, making sure that people don't browse to certain websites again, but you can actually go through and block, countries and whatnot, so people can't go to malicious sites in Russia or whatnot. So that's the full list of the stack. And that stack, just putting that in place will help you meet and have 90 points. It keeps you from getting a 90-point deduction from your self-assessment score. Hopefully that was a long-winded, but I wanted to at least make people understand what all that meant and then how it applied.
Thank you, Charlie. No, I think that was incredibly detailed and from the comments, very much appreciated. I want to be respectful of everyone's time and keep this to under an hour, but we did get another question as you were speaking. The biggest struggle we're having is defining our system boundaries due to a lack of definition around the CUI itself. Getting conflicting information from our primes, is there any guidance on how best to figure out what is considered CUI and what isn't?
Oop, I think you're muted again.
I'm sorry. Some files can have, some labeling on them, either if they're paper file, paper copies, or if they're digital files. That'd be one way to see, and that would be a way you can check in with your prime to see if there's some labeling technique that they have on their files. That's one way we've seen it. Unfortunately, the answer that, and think about it, if a prime hasn't really been following these practices or is trying to catch up themselves, it's going to be very difficult for them to go in and say, all of this is CUI in the past. They can have a practice for moving forward in the future, but a lot of companies, since they don't have that definition, their boundary is this big when it really needs to be this big. So I don't have any specific,
Magic wand.
this is what you should do, one-off thing. It's really continuing to communicate with your prime to see if you can get a handle on how they label the CUI. And if you can do that, then you can at least in turn search through what you have on premise and be able to, make some rules and boundaries around that.
Thank you, Charlie. Elizabeth, I believe that's all the Q&A we have for today.
All right, thank you. Let me just fast forward again to the end here. Thank you for all the great questions. We appreciate the participation. Again, just as a reminder, we have the 2 follow-on webinars coming up in consecutive weeks on April 7th, focusing in again on CMMC and specifically gap assessments, and then that following week, the 14th, on CMMC remediation and the ongoing compliance. So we'll look forward to you all joining us then as well, and a great dialogue. Look for an email from Bob Duffy. His email is below here. He'll be sending out the briefing from today, and obviously his phone number and email. We'd love to talk to you if there were questions you have that are specific to your environment or that we weren't able to get to today. Would obviously just love to be a resource and answer any additional questions that we can. So thank you all again on this last day of March here. Hope you have a fabulous rest of your day, and thank you again for joining us this morning. Thank you, Charlie, Greg, and Bob as well. Thank you all. Bye-bye.
Thanks, everyone.